Welcome to Studio Visits with Silver Eye, where I get to talk in depth with some of the most interesting contemporary photographers working today about their latest projects. I'm David Oresick, the Executive Director of Silver Eye Center for Photography. You can visit us online at silvereye.org to learn more about our programs, and you can find a helpful glossary for these conversations. In this episode, I spoke with Zoë Croggon, an artist based in Melbourne, Australia, who works in collage. Her practice considers the relationship between the body and its surroundings, contemplating the role we play in our environment and how deeply our surroundings inform the cadence of our everyday lives. Her work is created primarily from found photographs, examining the possibilities and limits of pictorial abstraction, metamorphosis, histories, and storytelling. In this conversation, we got to cover a lot of ground, including why she's so fascinated with photographs of athletes, what she's learned about the women of the Bauhaus, and just how much work it takes to make a composition look effortless. Enjoy this studio visit with Zoë Croggon. Zoë Croggon, welcome to Studio Visits with Silver Eye.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really interested in the way you've been using collage and collage to think about bodies and collage to think about space. But I was wondering if you could just kind of start this conversation by telling us how you began to work in collage and how you began to think about sourcing found material.
Yeah, I mean, I'd actually always collected images, for years. Since I'd been 10 years old or something, I'd sort of collected, arranged, and played with found imagery. It had just never really occurred to me that, it could be considered art. So I remember the first time I saw John Stedeker's work in a book that I borrowed from the library. It was like a revelation for me. It was like, A, this was work, and B, this kind of work could be taken seriously. So I began sort of collecting material more voraciously and working with the materials more and more and more. And I found that the more I made, the less I used. The more material I sort of gathered, the more I could pare it down, until I sort of found myself working with just a pair of images, so one overlapping the other. And I just loved the simplicity of that gesture.
How did you think about kind of pairing images, or what were your sort of concerns when you wanted to make these pairings?
I mean, I think, initially it was kind of incidental, sort of having collections, playing with them. And, it's funny, I was kind of thinking about this tendency to halve imagery today. I was kind of considering this, persistent halving. And I was thinking about it in the context of migraines, actually. From the onset of puberty, I've suffered from chronic migraines. And the Greek word for migraine is hemikrania, which means half skull, sort of referring to pain on one side of the head. And I was thinking about this conception of the half, or like the halving of the body that migraine inflicts. In my case, it's my right side. Throughout my adolescence, it was this constant physical assessment of what the right side of my body was doing, how it was feeling, is this the onset of a migraine or not? And I think that this really informed the way that I think about the body and my work, this sort of neat sort of segmenting or portioning of the body to conceive of it. So I think that, this is me speculating, but I think perhaps there's a compulsion there that is related to that.
I mean, that's really interesting. And I think thinking about, how so much of your work revolves around the body and revolves around, I think, these really athletic bodies, especially in your early pictures, you're taking moments from athletes, from dancers, from bodies that feel really strong and powerful, and to have this, I don't know, this kind of, like what you're describing, a kind of rootedness in pain, or thinking about your body's pain. Tell me about why you're so interested in these, or at least in these early works, why you become so interested in these really athletic bodies.
I had always thought about the athletic body in the world, and the way that it sort of, the resistance to the world, resistance against the world. And, I think that, I don't know, I think in terms of sport, it's interesting. I often think of the way that Christopher Lasch talks about sport in his book, The Culture of Narcissism. He has this chapter called The Degradation of Sport, where he discusses sport as an allegory for failure and success. And I found that really fascinating. You know, I mean, his take on it is that sport satisfies the intellectual and physical demands of the worker who have lost their tangible relationship with work. But I think in my case, it's true that sport is able to kind of evoke this vicarious emotive poignancy. You know, we sort of enter imaginatively into this world, and we can experience in a heightened form sort of the pain of defeat, or the triumph of persistence in the face of adversity through athletic imagery. And I think I find that interesting. You know, it does contain excesses often, and I think that's true of dance as well.
And you've got a background as a dancer, right?
Yeah, so I grew up dancing. You know, when I was very young, I did dance for a while, and until my parents could no longer afford to. And then in art school, our art school is adjacent to a dance school, and so I would sort of go to art classes and dance classes at night. And it was something that I had really, you know, ditched when I was younger in favor of like skateboarding and like other forms. But it was really interesting for me to return to this way of thinking about my body. I think dancing really introduced me to the possibility of the body being an objective and artistic instrument, you know, as like a narrative tool.
What I find really fascinating about your collages and what I really love about these early works is the connection to architectural spaces as well. And oftentimes it's having kind of directly has the body cut off, but also in a way that it appears to be entering a new space, or connecting with a new space, maybe rather than entering.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think through dance, I was kind of became fixated by how the body navigates space, you know, especially the correlation between the psychological and the physical response to the built environment. You know, I think sometimes I, you know, feel like moving through the world as an adult, it still feels like a kind of choreography, like getting on a train or buying milk at the supermarket. You know, it all feels reflective of the body moving through a built space. And I like noticing minor changes internally, like, you know, if my mood drops or my jaw starts to tense, you know, as I move through space. And I think built environments really inform those responses. And sometimes architecture feels sort of incidental or secondary to us, but, you know, it's so informative of how we move as a society within the world physically. And I like to bring that to the forefront.
To me, you know, one of the things your work helps me sort of see and understand, and I think it's one of those things that once you start noticing, you can't unsee, is, you know, I like that word, like that performance of how your body moves through space. And once you begin considering that, you kind of can't unconsider it, you know, or
Yes.
like if it comes to your attention, it really sort of dominates your attention. And, you know, how am I holding my body? How is this room? How is the space holding my body? And, you know, in these collages where you kind of really precisely control how these spaces abstract or contort, or not so much contort the bodies, but how much they kind of cradle the bodies is one of the words I keep thinking of, like thinking about this Untitled Number One image from Spring 1883, where the kind of cut in the paper is just really precisely, elegantly, purposefully holding this dancer's body here. I mean, I know precision is important to you in making these collages, but
Yes.
can you talk about how you are thinking about precision, and how you know, the element that I think about the most in your precision as a collage maker is continuing lines from one image to the next. There's almost always
Yeah.
3 or 4 or 5 points where a line from one image kind of just continues, like it was just made to continue into the next image. And that is, I mean, it's really beautiful. I guess my question is, how do you think about line when you're collaging?
It's interesting to hear someone say that. When I actually first entered art school, I was studying drawing, and I actually studied drawing for 4 years. So my whole background as an artist is actually in line drawing and in etching. And it was always a continuation of line that was a focus for me aesthetically. And when I first started playing with collage, I thought, is there a way to sort of continue this this sort of obsession with line and with form through photographs, and not just through one photograph, but perhaps two? And for me, that was always a sort of, a challenge I enjoyed playing with.
Tell me about your process. Tell me about what it's like in the studio for you.
Yeah, so in this, I guess when I first started making images, I didn't have, I had a sort of collection of materials, but I didn't have this backlog of things that I knew might work or things that I knew I was interested in. And, at first, and even now, sometimes it's this very loose dredging of material, like sort of loosely moving through the world and collecting bits. And, I have all these like really embarrassing books on massage and on golf, and like I have this horrendous book collection. But often it's images where you don't suppose that you will be able to find something, and then you will, in the sort of the tilt of a head or the curl of a finger, there'll be something that for me is gesturally poetic that maybe I can pair with something else. So I have a pretty solid aesthetic, but I try and source from everywhere.
Is the source material important to you, or is, in terms of like the where it comes from and what that might kind of mean for the final image, or are you really just focused on what the image is?
I mean, I think it's important because I avoid a large number of images perhaps where I might think it might be too recognizable or too iconic or too contemporary. I think that's as much about avoiding a lawsuit as it is about sort of trying to find images that I haven't seen before. I sometimes think that I have every book that was ever published on the Olympics that was ever possible. But, it's kind of thrilling when you come across something that you haven't seen, because it gives you the opportunity to experiment with form and line in a way that is different to, I think because my work, to some degree it's formulaic. It's incredibly simple. So I feel like I cast a very wide net.
I want to take a moment maybe to transition and talk about the newer work, the
Yeah.
magazine pictures, where I think you're focusing not as much on the athletic body. You're thinking a little bit more about the fashion model, or an element of fashion photography and advertising, and you're also thinking about paper really differently.
Yeah, so I mean, for this series, I was really thinking about the relationship between content and process. So I was wondering if there was a way I could imitate the sort of these lush, smooth garments featured in the magazines in how I make the work. So in this series, the pages are curled, they're folded, they're tucked, they're pinned. I'm trying to mimic the textural pliancy of fabric with paper. I think, because I've used the whole magazine, as it were, I think there's a sculptural three-dimensionality to these works, which is generally absent from my work. And for me, I think there was also kind of a violence in making this work I don't usually feel. I felt that I was slicing off limbs and beheading and bending bodies in two. Like, I was destroying the entire magazine. And I think this is what I find so interesting about the methodology of collage, because it's simultaneously destructive and constructive.
Mm.
On the one hand, you have sort of the destruction of imagery, the theft of previously existing material, the slicing up of the body. And on the other hand, you have, collage is this kind of delicate sort of contemplative incidental process, and I love that duality of it. It's kind of terrifying. Like, I think when you work with found imagery or, found objects or whatever, I'll go to a bookshop and find some like horrendous book on, cricket from like 1984 and like start hyperventilating. And I'm like, oh my God, like take it home and preciously sort of cradle it and scan it and play with it. But it is, you become very possessive and kind of obsessive about the images that you collect. And when you find an image that you think could be for you a work that of importance, it's terrifying to make that decisive cut.
I think that's an interesting evolution for me in the work, or oscillation maybe rather than evolution, is that interest in some of these early ones, which are super flat and seamless, and thinking about an image like Court, or some of these early athletic ones versus the later magazine ones, which we were just looking at, which have, I don't think it's unfair to call them sculptures, right? They have real depth and dimension and kind of structure and architecture to them. They are sort of decidedly not flat.
Yes.
And have that characteristic of being handled comes through for them in the way an old magazine that you flip through 100 times. And thinking about magazine number 3 even, which seems to have like a coffee stain or a water stain on the bottom, was sort of letting go of some of that precision a deliberate choice for you?
It definitely was. I mean, it's interesting because the magazine works, for me, they were so much harder to make. I recently spent an exorbitant amount of money on magazines because I wanted to continue this series, and it's like the ones that I had, within them, there were collages, but the ones that I have now, they don't exist, or at least I haven't been able to find them. It's like, sometimes I feel like I'm sort of wrenching these things together and trying to get them to fit, but there's a resistance. And other times it's just incidental. And that's, I guess, part of working with collage, I found imagery is that it's, this nature of chance. Mm-hmm. And I think that with these images, I think there's a softness to them with these works. Whereas I think there's a kind of hardness, there's a sort of, geometric sterility into some of those earlier flat ones, where the body feels like it's resisting its environment. Whereas these ones are sort of folding into each other. And I think it was really nice for me to have that sense of play.
You talked earlier about the interest in athletics and, stance and sport and these kind of powerful bodies, existing in this architecture and your kind of personal history with that. But for magazines, these mostly seem like fashion ads and fashion spreads. And these are, professional models to the extent bodies are being shown in these works. And I guess my question is, what is your relationship to this kind of body, or what does what does this kind of process say about this source material to you?
I think for me, looking through these magazines, I'm not somebody who sort of habitually buys them, and so I'm endlessly fascinated by them in a sort of anthropological way, I suppose. And for me, I was kind of stunned by how, like, surgically polished these bodies were. They felt already disembodied and sort of sexless, and it felt like I was simply, with the alterations that I made, I was just heightening that. There's no physicality or sort of these bodies, there's nothing visceral about them. They operate as objects, which is their purpose, of course, within the magazine. But for me, that's interesting then to pair with, literal objects, or to an architectural environment that is sort of inanimate.
I wanted to ask about another series where you were thinking about the Bauhaus, and you did a couple of collages, or not necessarily collages, a couple of pieces for the women of the Bauhaus.
Yeah, that's right. So I made a series of 4 works. I think it was last year. I'm having trouble keeping track of time at the moment. It was for the centenary of the Bauhaus. It was a group exhibition. And so I suppose I started thinking about the sort of omnipresence of the Bauhaus, really sort of stylistic. It's a stylistic foundation in art, architecture, and design, and really the sort of relative invisibility of the female artists that were part of the Bauhaus. So for this series, each of the works was created in homage, essentially, to a significant female artist from the Bauhaus. So the 4 works were named after Gertrude Grenau, Lotte Bies, Michiko Yamawaki, and Florence Henry, and they're actually photograms. So for those who don't know, photograms are photographic images made without a camera, by placing objects directly onto photographic paper and exposing them to light. And because photograms were experimented with so liberally in the Bauhaus school, I sort of wanted to use this technique and pair it with the photo collage technique typical of my work. And so they were made through, found photographs, cutouts, drawings on photo paper, which I then sort of played around with my desk lamp. And it was really fascinating for me. It was a real trial and error process, but it was amazing because it felt so basic at the same time as sort of sublimely alchemical. It was, a sort of a challenge, but, I found it interesting because I was thinking about, I suppose, history and this idea of the archive and constantly sourcing images from the archive. And I read the other day that the archive actually comes from the Greek archeon, which means house of the ruler. And I thought that was so fascinating because the archive is inherently political because it signifies an authority, you know, that has decided that that information is worth recording. And so accessing and disrupting the archive it feels political. So for me, this was a way of bringing those women to the forefront.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating etymology, and I think the idea of the Bauhaus being so influential in our lives, and for me, right, I was like, well, I could name, right, the 4 famous men, and probably, kind of embarrassingly, these women were kind of new to me when I saw them, and again, thinking about how little I really knew about this really foundational part of.
Well, me too.
What did you learn about these women when you began your research for this series?
So the only one I really knew the work of was Florence Henry, and I loved her photographic work, but I sort of thought of, obviously there were women, but they were usually sort of only ever, there were wives of, prominent figures of the Bauhaus or partners or so on and so forth. And I actually, I was quite shocked at how hard I had to research to find out more information about them. Like Michiko Yamawaki, I think she's the only non-white female artist that I could find in the Bauhaus, and it was so hard to find information on her. There's actually a great book called Bauhaus Women that was published last year as well, and it actually came out around the same time as the show was on. So for me, it was a great resource to go back to after making these works. But aside from that, it was really difficult, and the internet feels so endless, but it was kind of a finite resource in this regard because I could barely find anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an interesting point, right? The internet has this endless source of information until you start looking for the things that aren't there, and then it becomes really glaring.
Yeah.
Who's been excluded from these histories, because you were kind of doing this homage, and there was so little kind of published research. Did you end up feeling like you were making these kind of intuitively, or what sort of drove your kind of composition decisions?
I was consciously thinking about the work of the female artists and trying to sort of make them coherent with their practice. I think there's obviously, a bit of artistic license going on there, but I did consider their work and I tried to consider their identity as women in the Bauhaus as well, and their character. And Gertrude Grunau, for example, there's this really famous photograph of her wearing a dress, and she would run all these sort of movement-based classes, based on color and sound, and she had all these radical theories, and arguably some of her theories were kind of at the conceptual basis of the Bauhaus. But it's something that is just written about so little. But I sort of tried to convey the sense of very subtle sense of movement and shifting and color within the work, and so there are some considerations within there. But it was also intuitive, and also what I could achieve with my desk lamp and my photo paper late at night.
Could you tell me a little bit about the Kiri series you did in 2016?
That was really informed by the life and work of the Japanese author Yukio Mishima. So I was really in love with his writing, and have been for a long time. But he's this very fascinating character, who is kind of, for me, really representative of duality. So he would he would bodybuild by day, and he was obsessed with the divisions in his body as well. And he would bodybuild by day, and he would write at night. And all of these sort of, he wrote this really unusual manifesto called Sun and Steel, where he sort of detailed sort of crushing his feminine self and wearing this mask, and he would call it the Black Sun, which he would refer to the moon by night when he would write. And basically, he staged a coup, I think it was in 1974, a failed military coup where he tried to overtake the government and actually committed like a ritual Japanese suicide, like sort of halving his own body physically. And so he came to this really sort of devastating end. But I had just always found him a really fascinating character in terms of this idea of sort of incision and halving and fragmentation and duality and also conflict in terms of his life.
Wow. I mean, that's an author I was not familiar with, and what a crazy story. But I mean, again, I think all those concerns, you know, where you were thinking about the body and duality and conflict, and I think that's really interesting to me, because I began to think about so much of your collage work as decisions about harmony, between the two images, but here, and I think in some previous images, I now also see that lens of tension or conflict between the images.
I mean, I think so. I think, you know, when I first started making, you know, even the black and white series, you know, at the start, I wanted to think about the sort of, you know, soft, visceral human body in contrast to this sort of harsh architectural environments, and see if I could pair them. And the way that I found to do that was with these sort of, you know, severe, regimented, athletic images, you know. And so, you know, you have these contrasts, but then, you know, it's also about the malleability of form. You know, you can sort of bend these things and change them and alter them. And I suppose, you know, for me, there's it. A lot of it is about having two conflicting or disparate elements and trying to create a harmony with them.
One last question I wanted to ask you, in something, you know, I've been thinking about is when I think about collage historically in the fine arts, I think Dada is really where the Dada movement is where I think about it kind of emerging most prominently in the world of photography, especially in kind of altered photography. Is Dada important to you in thinking particularly about Hannah Hoch's work, and those really revolutionary and amazing collages?
Yeah, Hannah Hoch was another real sort of, she was an incredibly important figure to me when I first started making collage. You know, I remember when I was 17 or so and I had just started art school and I was sort of fumbling around with fragments of paper, my stepdad appearing at my bedroom door with the original catalogue of Cut with a Kitchen Knife, which was an exhibition that Hannah Hoch had, and it had a number, you know, I've sort of got it over there or something. I still have it now. It's incredible. And the works that she made, it was the same sort of, you know, epiphany, this revelation of collage being taken seriously as a fine art, but also as being this sort of incredibly conceptually rigorous sort of analysis for Hannah Hoch, especially of her direct materials, you know, of magazine and materials from her time. John Stezik is completely different because he's reaching back. It's like a nostalgia, you know, he's dredging up these images from the past, whereas Hannah Hoch, it felt like it was a direct response to her environment. She was using magazines, she was using newspapers, you know, it was there and it was visceral and it was sort of these guttural tears. And for me, that was just, you know, it was kind of fascinating. And I think, you know, with Hannah Hoch's work, it's so much in the making, it's so much in the process, and it's so much in, you can see her hand and you can see the way that she's sort of twisted a bit of paper and torn it. And for me, there's feeling in that, you know, and obviously it's different to mine. I'm literally sitting there, you know, with like a guillotine, every millimeter has to be perfect, but it's a different way of making. But, you know, yeah, for hers, I think they have a force because of that process.
Well, I think about your practice feels like it's often interested in making it look easy. You know, right? Like there's a kind of interest in conveying an effortlessness to it in the way that, you know, going back to athletes and dancers and models, right? That's their business, is to do something incredibly difficult and make it look effortless.
Yes.
And I think that's a little bit your business as well with these images, is to show something that feels like complete, and you kind of couldn't imagine it any other way, because it feels like it kind of the pieces have locked into place.
I'm glad to hear that. That's what I'm trying to do. I mean, I think, you know, it's kind of hilarious. You know, you spend years and, you know, months and, you know, weeks collecting and killing yourself to make it perfect. And but I think you can do that and it can feel like there's a disjunct, or you can do that and it can feel harmonious even if you have sort of disparate material conceptually. Yeah, it's good to hear that. That's what I'm trying to do.
Excellent. Well, Zoë Croggon, thank you so much for sharing your work with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.